Good afternoon. My name is Irfan Nuruddin. I'm a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, also in Washington, D.C. It is my honor to moderate this panel for the 115th annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. The panel will focus on advancing human rights through U.S. foreign policy, challenges, and opportunities. To discuss these issues, the organizers of this conference have assembled a real incredible star cast of some of the leading and bravest civil society activists and lawyers working on the frontier of human rights. And they will be joined by Representative Joaquin Castro from the US House of Representatives as well. Really quickly, though none of these individuals require much of an introduction, allow me nonetheless to introduce them in alphabetical order. Representative Castro represents the 20th Congressional District from the state of Texas. He is currently in his fourth term in the U.S. House of Representatives on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was most recently one of the House impeachment managers in the second impeachment trial of ex-President Donald Trump. Karuna Nandi is an Indian lawyer at the Supreme Court of India with degrees from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, Cambridge University, and Columbia University. Ms. Nandi has played a significant role in drafting the anti-rape bill in India after the horrific 2012 Delhi gang rape. In 2019, the UK Foreign Office appointed her to a new panel of experts to develop legal frameworks to protect freedom of the media across the globe. Dr. Sophie Richardson is the China Director of the Human Rights Watch. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia and Oberlin College and the new author of numerous articles on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, and human rights. She has testified before the European Parliament and the US Senate and House of Representatives. Mr. Nuri Turkel is the first US-educated Uyghur American lawyer and human rights advocate, born in a re-education camp at the height of China's Cultural Revolution, and he spent the first several months of his life in detention with his mother. He came to the United States as a student and was granted. In 2020, Speaker Nancy Pelosi appointed Mr. Turkel as Commissioner of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Finally, but by far not the least, Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan is the founding editor of The Wire. He was earlier the editor of the Hindu newspaper and a recipient of the Shorenstein Journalism Award and the Ramnath Goenka Award for Journalist of the Year. He has taught at New York University and the University of California, Berkeley, and worked previously at the Times of India. With that incredible panel, it is only a disappointment that we'll only have roughly 55 minutes to hear their views and to set the conversation. But to continue the conversation, we encourage you who are able to join us on March 24th from 1:15 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern, following the airing of this recorded roundtable, where some of the panelists will join you live to take your questions and to just continue the conversation on these incredibly pressing issues. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Dr. Richardson. Sophie, if you could just take a few minutes to tell the audience from your perspective what they should know about the situation in China from the perspective of the human rights challenges currently in that country and in its wider orbit that should frame this conversation. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. It's a real honor to be with such distinguished panelists. I think the Chinese government would want to point to its having joined a number of the key international human rights treaties and to the kind of efforts it's made to raise the standard of living across the country. But from the perspective of Human Rights Watch, particularly the tenure of Xi Jinping has had disastrous consequences for human rights. And just a few areas to highlight. The kind of legal reform that we saw making progress in the 90s and the aughts has not just stalled, but really been reversed in ways that has consequences for people's ability to bring claims, no matter how small, against the state. The small but fledgling human rights community and broad community of civil society activists who worked on everything from rural literacy to environmental pollution to religious freedom has really been quite assiduously crushed by the current government. Third, its policies, the government's policies towards ethnic and religious minorities have really taken on apocalyptic proportions. We were talking about serious human rights crimes being committed, particularly against Uyghurs, Professor Turkel's community, with similar comparable problems against Tibetans, for example, in Hong Kong as well. And fourth, we've seen the rise of an extraordinary state-backed high-tech surveillance system that really now permeates the country such that it's very difficult to do anything out of the state's line of sight. And that has implications for people's access or their willingness or their ability to use other rights. I want to point out that the Chinese government's human rights violations are not confined by its borders, that increasingly we see it pursuing very aggressive policies on human rights, whether that's through the Belt and Road Initiative or at institutions like across the UN's human rights ecosystem. And perhaps one of the issues that affects all of us is the Chinese government's efforts to restrict free speech, whether we're talking about specific issues or policies Beijing doesn't want people to talk about, or whether we're talking about, the manager of the Houston Rockets tweets causing an international outcry. This has consequences for businesses, for governments, for individuals. And it's really an issue that I think governments need to be seized of. So hopefully that paints a portrait to start off the conversation.
Thank you. That did very vividly. If I could turn to you very late at night in Delhi, with taping this conversation on a day when Freedom House downgraded India to the status of partly free in its ranking of countries around the world, a rare dishonor for a country that has long been seen as a beacon of democracy in the developing world. How do you summarize for our audience the state of play on human rights, on the state of India's democracy at this particular moment in time?
I think that the state of play is best exemplified by our Home Minister's statement saying that much of the human rights framework was a Western construct, right? Which sort of opens the door to the pick and choose approach. My country now ranks number 142 out of 180 in the World Press Freedom Index, and our ranking has dropped from 133 in 2016. I think sometimes these indices have challenges, but I think it's very much borne out by the sort of journalists that I represent, the fact that the highest number of journalists have been arrested covering the recent farmers' protests since 1993 this month. And under the new ethno-religious right-wing government, human rights and defenders and journalists face huge challenges, including arbitrary arrest, detention, and prosecution as a means of silencing them. There was a recent case that gained huge prominence, the case of a 22-year-old climate change activist. And the Sedition Law she was accused essentially of sedition for speaking up. And the Sedition Law is defined as, at the lowest threshold, spreading disaffection against the government. And you would think that that's really the job of any opposition party in any democracy, right? It has been read down by the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, in our courts, the process is very much the punishment when it comes to criminal laws against, using criminal laws against journalists. We had a Sessions Court that cited an old judgment that continues to be relevant. It's interesting that it was during British rule. And what they said was that the offense of sedition can't be invoked to minister to the wounded vanity of governments. We don't see this enough, though. We don't see sort of quick determinations of this sort of thing enough. And even this young girl was in jail for over a week for something that was, very much should be within the ambit of free speech. In terms of women's rights, India ranks 133 out of 167. Again, that's a drop in position from 2017. Dalit women, which is sort of so-called lower caste women, and there's a huge effort to include Dalit women in third, in the third as a racial minority, and also ethnic minorities are the most vulnerable towards these crimes. And there's this sort of institutionalized rape of Dalit women that still exists. For example, you can't be married until you go to the house of the upper caste man and be raped by him. I'm leading a case to criminalize marital rape. At the moment, it is explicitly not criminal. And about 93% of the rapes that happen actually happen in the context of marriage, more than 93%, and it's explicitly not criminal. That's still pending in court. In terms of our Me Too movement, we had a recent positive decision in the Priya Ramani case against a former union minister, where they said that you should be able to choose your forum, the forum in which you wish to speak. And I think that's wonderful, because I think that we've got to strengthen due process and make courts and the police safe spaces for women before insisting that they go to court before they speak up. Now, in terms of the drop in the freedom index, the Freedom House scores, and our downgrading from free to partially free, it's a really important point that you raised, Irfan, but I think it's also notable that the US was the other country to drop. And I think this is something that points us in a sort of quite an important direction, which is that I think in today's multipolar world of strong and rising sovereignties, it's particularly difficult to speak of sort of one country holding, telling another to sort out its human rights problems, right? Each country has challenges, and very, very serious challenges, and I think increasing challenges in many of the largest democracies, so-called democracies in the world. Now, where does this take us? Well, I think that most of us here are people who are invested and work in the area of international law and multilateralism. However, I also lead the Bhopal cases in the Supreme Court. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, those are the cases arising out of the Bhopal gas tragedy that US company incorporated in New York, Union Carbide, allowed to happen. Now, that company has merged with Dow Chemicals, and we saw a memo sent by an Obama Assistant Secretary of State to our Planning Commission, asking them to sort the Dow problem out. This was leaked by WikiLeaks. We wouldn't have seen it otherwise. Also, during the current farmers' protests, there was a note by the current State Department. I mean, there was a statement by the State Department that spoke of the State Department's support to free speech, which I think is great. These are international issues, regardless of which country they arise in. Just like Black Lives Matter, I think that's an international issue. At the same time, the next bit was particularly troubling. And the next bit was this, that the State Department said that they support free markets and believe in free markets, right? Now, while this may look at first glance innocuous, what underlies the farmers' protest is farm laws that look to liberalize the farming structure and most OECD countries subsidize farming. And so I think that there is a big conflict of interest there, because at the moment, we have electoral bonds that fund our present government, and those are our present ruling party, and those are a black box. We don't know which companies have contributed. We don't know which foreign agribusinesses contribute. And as I was saying earlier about the protection to Dow and Union Carbide, as well as now we're seeing this, speech about these statements about supporting free markets in agriculture, I do wonder whether a country can step away from the protection of domestic companies and domestic trade unless there's an investment in multilateralism. I know it's hard, particularly in the present day, but I also don't think that there's any stepping away from it. We all know the massive problems with the UN, but in terms of the globe, I think that's pretty much all we've got. But there are other efforts that I think are possible. Let's go to the low-hanging fruit first. I think for the American Society of International Law, it would be truly wonderful to have much more judicial exchanges. The Bangalore Principles of Commonwealth judges, and I know that the US isn't a part of the Commonwealth, have been hugely helpful and salutary, because what happened from there was that these judges decided that any lacuna in domestic law could be filled by international law. And this is very important in common law jurisdictions. And this was taken forward in a very dramatic way. So that's, I think, low-hanging fruit that could happen quite easily. But also, I think that there's an opportunity with the emerging D10, because while it's true that the largest 10 democracies have an investment in dealing with the Chinese technological threat, it's also important to, I think, strengthen the moral legitimacy. And I know that that's not a fashionable word anymore, to help a global compact.
That's great.
I'll end that.
No, thank you. And lots of big ideas there that we need to come back to. Siddharth, if I may go to you, also extremely late in the you are to the issues that Karuna just mentioned. In fact, you have undoubtedly been on the receiving end of any number of accusations of sedition and all sorts of other things in recent months, given your incredible work as a journalist. But if I could ask you both to maybe speak to those issues, but also broaden out. I mean, Karuna fundamentally raises this challenge about, in this moment in which a U.S. legitimacy and the imprimatur of U.S. sort of, right to speak on the moral stage is questioned right and left, including within the United States. Is there anyone in Delhi who's actually worried about what the United States has to say in terms of exercising moral sort of sanction, moral coercion over, alleged excesses of the current government in Delhi? In other words, is there actually any power over here to be exercised?
Right. Thank you for having me. And the short answer is that I think the days when a government in India and perhaps governments in many other countries would fear some sort of US action in response to violations of human rights or deviations from international human rights standards. Those days are long gone. And they've gone for a variety of reasons, partly to do with something Karuna hinted at, which is America's own credentials. Less robust today after 4 years of Trump, but even before Trump, the display of double standards and the display of kind of a contingent approach to to human rights, a transactional approach to bilateral relationships in general, have put a question mark about the sort of moral authority of the United States to exert influence. And that's at one end. At the other end, the growing economic and strategic relationship between the US and India means that you have very large constituencies that would not want extraneous considerations, and rights, human rights broadly would come under that, to come in the way of not just business as usual, but the future trajectory of business and economic opportunities. The United States is, of course, a huge trading partner of India. You veer between being number one and number two. Right now, China, thanks to the slowdown in global trade and the fact that the Chinese are doing better than anybody else on the economic front. So China is back at is at number one, but the US is a most important trading partner. US is a big source of investment, big source of technology. The US is a huge defense partner. India buys a lot of defense equipment from the United States. I think the cumulative value of purchases over the last 15 years is well in excess of $10 billion, perhaps closer to 20. And there's lots more in the pipeline as far as Indian expenditure is concerned. Right now, there's pretty aggressive marketing happening from the US side for India to buy upwards of, our Air Force is committed to buying 100 more fighter aircraft. And the F-18 is in the race, the F-15 is in the race. And these are huge contracts in dollar terms and highly significant in terms of, jobs, all the issues which a US administration simply cannot ignore. So my sense is that New Delhi is going to be fairly confident about human rights considerations not really coming in the way of US-India relations. So yes, I think they are conscious of the fact that there is less. I don't think that the kind of approval or the kind of free pass that they had in the Trump era, the kind of ideological affinity between Modi's government and what Trump was doing, all that has ended and they're aware of it. But having said that, I think that they are quite confident of being able to deal with statements, rhetoric, and I would say, punishments of one kind or the other. I mean, don't forget that even at the height of India-US bonhomie, Modi-Trump, the US was trying to impose sanctions on India for wanting to buy the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. So the CAATSA, C-A-A-T-S-A legislation was being invoked to have sanctions against India because India was buying major weapon systems from Russia. So India is used to sanctions of one kind or the other being imposed, and they haven't really rocked the boat. So my sense is that there is acute awareness of the fact that the kind of backing that enthusiastic backing that Modi got, incidentally, not just in the Trump era, right? Go back to the first 2 years of Modi's government, 2014 to 2016. Look at his first visit to the United States in 2014. There was, he was widely feted and, welcomed, and the assumption was that the Indian economy under Modi is going to be great for American business. And to a large extent, that was, that expectation has been borne out. And I think that central preoccupation with creating and exploiting business opportunities is going to be what drives the trajectory of the relationship. One factor I haven't spoken of so far is the US-India-China triangle. And here again, there is acute awareness in Delhi that as US-China relations deteriorate, or as kind of contradictions emerge and sharpen, the US would be wary of taking steps that would weaken India economically, and that the US would very much want to keep India as an ally. And you have, beginning with Trump, but I think Biden would also be committed to that, this idea of the Quad, bringing together India, Australia, Japan, and the United States as a kind of counterbalance to China. So these elements, I think there's confidence in Delhi that these things will remain. And I would say from the the rights community in India is kind of these are people who have spent their entire lives castigating the United States for bullying other countries, for its double standards, and I think there was many people in India shared the there was this perception that Trump is also making things much worse. But even as people expect Biden to not give a free pass to Modi on various issues, I think to do with freedom of the press, for example, civil liberties in general, even Jammu Kashmir, I think I would expect the Biden administration to be a bit more vocal than the Trump administration was. But even the Trump administration, after the reading down of Article 370, said things which the Modi government didn't like. So I think that these elements will be there, but I don't see the Modi government worried about any fundamental shift in US policy under Biden on the human rights question.
Thank you for that. Congressman, if I may bring you into this conversation, realizing that you have to leave before the session will be fully over. There's a lot of big ideas here that I'm sure you've been listening to, and many ways somewhat provocative, but a lot of them remind me of the very powerful remarks you made during the impeachment trial, in which you argued that America's legitimacy abroad begins by defending American democracy at home. And every one of our panelists thus far has remarked that we have a lot of rebuilding to do at home so that America can be that beacon of freedom that it has always aspired to be abroad. Can you touch on that relationship between the strengthening of American democracy at home so that it can be an agent for change abroad? And then I've got a follow-up to you as well.
Sure. No, and it's great to be with you all. As I said in the Senate trial, the strength of America is the strength of its example. For generations, the United States has stood as a North Star for certain things, for freedom, for democracy, for human rights, for rooting out corruption. No doubt, there has been criticism from different parts of the world during that time. Some of that criticism well warranted. But the United States has fundamentally been a nation that is democratic and also that respects the rule of law. What was so troubling about the Trump years and about the behavior of our former president is that he shook the rule of law in the United States by what he incited on January 6th, which was an insurrection and a form of an attempted coup of the United States government. So then the question becomes, as a nation that has been a North Star, how do you go forward and continue to speak in moral terms, speak about issues like human rights, abuses of the rule of law, abuses of people's freedom, for example? How do you do that with any kind of authority? And I won't lie to you, we're climbing out of a bit of a hole here. But I do think because of the fundamental structures of the country, you have a long-standing democracy that elects its leaders. And for everything that Donald Trump did, Donald Trump left the White House. There was a transition of power. It wasn't as peaceful, obviously, as the nation would have liked, but there was a transition of power to a new president. And so that still speaks to the world. And what happened during the Donald Trump years, and why I think you see more people being abused around the world, at least in part, is because there were authoritarian leaders and autocrats around the world who felt like nobody was minding the human rights shop. The United States was not doing anything about it. The United States was not watching. I think that's how some of them felt. That's how you get, I think the abuses, although it's been going on for a while, but more abuses of the Rohingya. You have issues in Turkey and Hungary, Bolsonaro with the indigenous in Brazil, Venezuela, all of these issues that continue. And so the Biden administration is dedicated, is committed to getting the United States back to being engaged on those issues and not going it alone, but mustering the forces of our allies as well in a positive way to speak up for human rights and speak up for those who have been dispossessed. And we're living in a different age now than even, I would argue, 10 years ago. We're living in an ever more increasingly transparent world because of technology and social media. And that's true not just internationally. In other words, more people around the world can see what's happening in the United States because all of us in the United States and in many other countries, many people in other countries, are essentially walking around as social documentarians with cell phones that can videotape anything in an instant. And then they can distribute it through technological channels. And I think that has had a profound impact on governments and people around the world. And so, you talk about nationally, just domestically, the other challenges that we've had is the rule of law within our own country, systemic racism in our country. You think about the Black Lives Matter movement that also was not only confined to the United States, but also was a spark that drove conversations and change and outpouring of protests around the world. And so there are other issues like that domestically that are also very powerful and are inspiring change. And then one thing that I would mention also as we think about going forward and standing up for human rights, we have to get control to make sure that disinformation is not rampant on our social media platforms. Because if you look at how people become targets, one of the big ways that people now become targets is through disinformation, misinformation that comes across on these new technologies that have only blossomed over the last 10 years that have come into full bloom. But the potential for abuse is only going to get worse as technology, as artificial intelligence, as deep fakes and other technology will make it easier for bad actors to then target different groups or specific issues and create malfeasance. And so all of these things are things that the Biden administration and the United States Congress are looking at as we think about how we approach the world and make sure that we're speaking up for human rights.
That's many wonderful points over there, Congressman. And then that last one on disinformation is particularly tricky when we start thinking of governments as actually being a major source of that disinformation as well, and also using the language of disinformation to justify crackdowns on the media, right? The government has announced a number of rules to police online social media, partly under the guise of fighting disinformation. So very complex issues, but I'm so glad to hear, as I'm sure the listeners are, that the Biden administration is going to take this seriously. While we do have you, let me ask you one other question. Earlier today, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, in a pretty significant speech, made the argument that for diplomats have to show the American people why foreign policy matters to them. Within your congressional district, as in every other congressional district in America, the American people have had a very difficult year and a half. I imagine there's any amount of tremendous suffering that your constituents have had on health, the loss of loved ones, economic distress. How do you talk to them? What are you hearing from them why should they care about what's happening in China? Why should they care about what's happening in India or Venezuela or Brazil, etc.? There's so much at home. Do you worry that there's a moment of American isolationism, that's a very strong word, I realize, that will transcend the Trump administration, but for different reasons? There's just a fatigue on the part of the American people that makes foreign policy and defending human rights seem like let somebody else do it. It's America has to figure out how to help Americans. What would your reaction to that be?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't think there's any doubt that nations around the world, populations have been somewhat turned in because of the pandemic and because each of our nations is handling the pandemic and trying to rid its country and hopefully be helpful to the rest of the world in ridding the world of the pandemic. But no, in the longer term, I'm not concerned about that hindering the United States' ability to be a leader among nations. When I think about my district, and I have a bread and butter district, by that I mean I represent San Antonio, Texas, and it is a working class city. It's a place of what I would consider humble and hardworking people who are very focused on jobs, education, their healthcare, their kids' futures, and so forth. But it's also a city with incredible international ties and longstanding international ties in Latin America and Asia and other places around the world. And of course, the most immediate thing that Americans think about when they think about our relationships with other countries is our trade, the trade that we do with other nations, whether it's India or Mexico or Japan or other nations. And so I've always found that oftentimes that's an entryway to talk about our interdependentness and why other nations matter to us. But obviously, it's much more than that. It's not just how much money you can make off of people or what you can sell them. It's also about the fact that this is a nation of immigrants. Our nation is a very diverse nation because people from all over the world throughout the generations have blessed us by coming here and applying their talents to make this country a better place. And so I believe that in that spirit, we're going to continue to go forward and be a nation that is leading again on democracy and freedom and human rights and all of those things. And that also more immediately, you'll see the Biden administration be more involved in helping the world rid us of COVID-19 and its variants. I thought that it was shameful that the Trump administration, I remember there was one story that came out about the Trump administration trying to cut a deal with a company in Germany so that they would have an exclusive use of a vaccine. That is not the spirit of the United States throughout the generations. And you're going to see a very different tone and approach from this administration.
Thank you, Congressman. I hope you can stick around a bit, but knowing you have a very busy schedule, thanks for the time. And also stay safe. I know this is still a very challenging time for you and your colleagues in the House and at the Capitol. Mr. Turkle, if I could bring you into the conversation, thank you for your patience. You serve on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. Obviously, you are a shining example of that. The contributions of immigrants and refugees who came to America and became Americans. And yet the community from which you come, as Sophie said at the outset, an apocalyptic situation for the Uyghur people. What would you like to see the Biden administration do? What should we be doing in the spirit of the conference theme of creative international law in a moment of crisis? Where is there hope? What are the opportunities over here from where you sit? You're currently muted, sir.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of today's important conversation. I would say that two things has to happen. One is the continuity of what the previous administration put in place, imposing targeted sanction against the abusive Chinese officials, and also going after China's economic interest, namely this paramilitary unit called Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp. XPCC is the acronym, that believed to have over 800,000 shell companies around the world and control much of the cotton fields and cotton production system, including the water resources. So the decision such as this, and also the entity list designation, apparently have been yielding some good outcome. One of the Chinese suppliers recently filed a complaint type of report with the Chinese stock exchange that American companies are keep canceling the contract with them. So they're costing them over $55 million damage. So the continuity is very important. And the other thing that I would like to see the Biden administration doing is to open up case against the Chinese officials or entities, including American companies that have been either wittingly or unwittingly facilitating the ongoing genocidal campaign. With that, the US government or Blinken State Department can accomplish two things. One, encourage our partners and allies to take a similar stance. Some of the US allies and partners have Magnitsky Act-like legal tools available for them to use to go after human rights abusers. And then two, it will put to rest the ongoing relitigation of the genocide determination by some journalists, some people in academia. I don't have to be very diplomatic, but those conversations are nothing more than a distraction. So that law journal articles, academic research papers can wait until we stop this genocide. We're seeing some positive development, particularly in Canada, in UK, in Netherlands. Australia might be the next. There's some very active parliamentarian engagement in the ongoing atrocities, labeling them or giving them a proper name. Each crime, we're lawyers here, the crime should have a name. Giving a name to ongoing atrocities, a serious crime, should be a non-controversial matter. But people trying to politicize what has been done by the previous administration and endorsed by the current administration is some sort of a hot topic. The Uyghur peoples are dying as we speak and suffering as we speak through this new form of genocidal campaign have been in the works for many, many years. But it just reached to the conscience of the people in the free world in the last 3-4 years. So as US government stated, this is a new type of challenge, new type of genocidal campaign, largely been facilitated by China's economic almighty as well as the technological advantages. So those are the two things that the Biden administration could do immediately or swiftly. And in the long term, there are a couple of things also should be done. One, the next year's Winter Olympics is something that need to be revisited. It is unfair to the athletes to go to China, go to Beijing, and compete in the backdrop of the industrial scale prison system that the Chinese set up. We're talking about over 1,200 prison camps, modern day concentration camps. And also it will be unfair to the athletes or athletic spirit competing in the backdrop of CCP's genocidal campaign. So I think the international community should delay the games or move it to somewhere else. So this is something that the Biden administration is in a well position to rally.
Thank you for that very comprehensive and thoughtful set of answers. Sophie, if I could bring you back in. Nuri mentioned the Secretary of State's use of the term genocide. How significant is that from your perspective? And what might you either sort of push back on to Nuri just for the sake of discussion, or what would you want to amplify from what he just said?
I think, first of all, the use of the term is an important way of acknowledging this particular community's nightmare, which is certainly not new and it's certainly not over. I think one of the key steps, especially if we're talking about how to deploy international law, will be to hold the Chinese government accountable in the same way that any government should be held accountable for committing serious human rights crimes. And that typically starts with an independent investigation of the kind that we've seen around, for example, the Rohingya, or for North Korea, or for Venezuela, or other situations. then makes recommendations to a body like the Human Rights Council about how to proceed. But I think there's also room, while we're being creative about uses of the law, to explore things like universal jurisdiction cases. We realize that those are certainly, hard-won or hard-fought political battles. But I think the case that's just come to pass this past week with convictions of Syrians in Germany, perhaps raises some possibilities of other kinds of cases that people from the community could pursue. But to link Secretary Blinken's use of the term to actual policy, we want to see the US and other governments push for investigations with a view towards denying Chinese government officials the kind of impunity that they have come to expect and that we think has enabled serious human rights violations.
Thank you. So Siddharth and Karuna, and feel free to decide who takes this one. In many ways, one of the challenges when we try and have the conversation as broadly as we're trying right now is that for all the concerns that you both articulated very eloquently that India is facing, at this point in time, there is no equivalent to what is happening to the Uyghurs, for instance, in China. What is the challenge from your perspective in terms of the narrative, right? Does it allow the Indian government or defenders of, say, the current status quo to say, don't put us in the same camp. India is a democratically elected government. These laws you might not like them, but they go through parliament. Not a lot of discussion in parliament, but they do go through parliament, etc. Right? How do we is there a unifying framework over here, or is it really that we need two separate conversations about what's happening in India versus what's happening in China, etc.? Any reactions to that? Siddharth, can I ask you to...
Yeah. This is the first time I've taken part or actually been in a session where on the human rights front, India and China are spoken of together. And there's a reason for that, right? The reason for that is that the two situations are very different. Structurally, in terms of historical, in terms of the political systems, and frankly, I think it's interesting to frame a conversation around the subject of US, India, China, in order to understand how strategic, commercial, business, defense issues, and this question of democracy, how they play themselves out, right? So in the Indian and American narrative, the fact that India and the US share democratic values is very central to the construct of new partnerships in Asia, right? So the whole idea of the Quad, for example, is structured around the fact that these are four democracies, even though actually what unites these four countries are strategic and commercial interests, but the language that couches this is democracy. So when India slips in the democratic index, I do think it undermines the essential logic and rationale for these kinds of groupings. But I don't think that the rights situation is really comparable. But I think I had dinner with an former Indian diplomat the other day, and he made an interesting comment as to how he had dealt extensively with the United States during the nuclear deal and for other important negotiations, and he said that there was enormous bipartisan support in Washington for better relations with India, and the reason for that was because there was enormous respect for what India had built over 7 decades in terms of democratic institutions. And the fear is that as India squanders that legacy, it will never, I hope, ever approach the scale of what China is doing in terms of rights violations. But, frankly, even but the kind of deviations that we do see today are enough to make the world, question what's happening in India. And I think that that itself is damaging for India, for Indians, for India's place in the world, and the kind of respect that India, had in countries across all continents, right, for the kind of democracy and society it had built. So when we are seen as less tolerant, less democratic, more repressive, you don't need to go anywhere near what the Chinese are doing in terms of scale. But the kind of deviations that we have seen are doing their own damage.
Thanks for that. And of course, one other difference, I suspect, that would be interesting for the broader conversation is the role of the diasporas, right? As the Indian diaspora over here tends to be pretty pro what's happening in India in terms of, right, whereas the diaspora in the United States from China is arguably pushing the US to be harder on China in terms of the human rights. We actually have countervailing forces among US policymakers. Karuna, on the one hand, everything Siddharth said, I suspect resonates, that these are not directly comparable. And yet you yourself use the terms of institutionalized rape, right, of what has happened to the Dalit populations in terms of a history of oppression, etc. In terms of scale, arguably, though not maybe as concentrated as what's happening in the Uyghurs, but in terms of scale, one might argue, just for the sake of provocation, that it approaches, maybe even exceeds, in terms of the number of people affected by, systemic social repression, etc. But beyond that, the courts in India have always played this fascinating role of being both, interpreters of laws, but also the makers of laws. And right, and you, as your day job, are in the courts arguing on behalf of new laws and new excluded communities. Do you think the courts can right themselves to be a force for justice and human rights in India, or are you concerned that the courts have sort of lost their way? That's a bit pointed, but what future for the Indian courts from your perspective? You need to unmute.
So that's a good question. Look, in terms, just to speak very quickly about the China-India grouping, I think that tends to be a question frankly, I think that tends to be a question mostly in the US or in, other countries that, just think of us as adjacent countries and large countries, and I think that's to some extent where the similarity ends, because we're all in the talking professions, right? We're either sort of lawyers and academics and journalists, and I could make a similar argument for the US and India. I could draw parallels between the shooting of young Black children by police and police atrocities here, right? So there are, I think there are parallels that can be drawn everywhere, but honestly, I think that I really quite agree with what Siddharth is saying, is that when we're looking at, say, the D10, or when we're looking at that sort of interconnection, is when it becomes centrally relevant to speak about India and China and, other parts of the world. But otherwise, honestly, I don't think the parallels are relevant. Now, that's a really good question on the courts. And I think the role of the courts has been extremely troubling to those of us who have spent our lives deeply invested in constitutionalism and individual rights that stand against majorities. Because the Supreme Court that I am most familiar with is the court that I'm most familiar with, and in some ways it's definitely the most important individual court. We've seen, for example, cases being allocated in ways that are opaque and unpredictable by various masters of the roster, our Chief Justice, and that has been somewhat troubling. We've seen the collegium system, which was about the appointment of judges, where the senior-most judges would appoint other judges, was, not perfect, but a sort of system of seniority was followed. And that gave a certain amount of predictability. And that has been bypassed in a large number of recent cases. We've seen some inconsistency in free speech cases where the case was against a person who is sort of being called the Radio Rwanda of India, Arnab Goswami, when he went to the Supreme Court for bail, and the case was allocated to a judge who was very progressive. Now, I'm not impugning motives. This could entirely be happenstance. But in many other cases, the court has said that don't come directly to the Supreme Court, go to another court and try your luck there first. So I think there are many issues that are deeply troubling to constitutionalists on the bench and off. But we see judgments very often, including the one that gave including the Sessions Court judge, the District Court judge that gave Disha Ravi bail, saying that, speech needn't minister to the vanity of governments, right? And saying that in very explicit terms. And I have great hope of our courts, and that's why many of us engage.
Well done. Keep doing it. We need you. Sophie and Nuri, one can't help but think of the current moment, and even today, both with Secretary Blinken's speech, with NSA Sullivan's interim policy guidance. Some have described this as, once again, the new Cold War. Even when we think about the multilateralism that Karuna, for instance, mentioned, or the strategic alliances and the use of allies that Representative Castro mentioned, it seems like where we are at right now is a framework in which China is the threat that needs to be contained, needs to be challenged, etc. Can I challenge us to think, is there a way to bring China in a way that's more collaborative? Or do you think that where the current moment is requires antagonism, requires sanctions, requires a heavy-handed, or have we given up hope on diplomacy, on persuasion, on collaboration for the sake of argument? So Sophie and Nuri, in a couple of minutes, maybe 1 minute each on that question, and then it'll be time. So Sophie?
It's a big question to tackle in 1 minute, but
yes, ma'am.
I do think that it's the Chinese government that, to a large extent, has removed itself from collaborative discussions, and increasingly is coercively or in less subtle ways imposing its preferences and policies on multilateral institutions and on potential partners. But I wouldn't ever give up hope on collaborations between people of one country and people of another. Nobody should confuse the Chinese government with people across China, and I think that has to try to survive. One of the demonstrations in the last month has been, some of the discussions on Clubhouse between Uyghurs and Chinese people who've never really had the opportunity to interact outside of government-controlled settings, and some of those conversations have been incredibly moving and led to a recognition of serious violations against Uyghurs in very personal terms. And I think that really speaks to the importance of keeping that kind of contact alive and open.
Thank you, Sophie. Nuri, you get the last word. What would you say?
I agree with everything that Sophie said. But my concern is that the international community leadership here in the United States or China experts continue to mix up the China that we know before they start collectively punishing their own citizens in a daylight. Not only that, exporting the same brutality, same methods, same techniques to other countries. There are more than 80 countries have adopted Chinese way of surveilling its own population. It's a fact. It's rapidly expanding. And also one of the concerns that I have is that people mixing up their views with China and CCP. Sophie is spot on. We should not ignore the people of China, the Chinese people, who are also a victim of Xi Jinping's brutal policies. So I think the focus should be on CCP. I can't emphasize enough of the importance of the original ideas coming from the CCP, the Communist Party leadership, whether it be domestic or international. This is very heavily involved in the foreign policy initiatives as well. Just listen to what Xi Jinping said a couple of days ago. They're on something. They are very serious. And their ambassador to Washington, Sui Jiankei, told the world through CNN without any pushback that the international community, the American people, need to learn how to live with the China we have today, not the China that the international community would like to have. That should have a chilling effect in our thinking and seeing the way we see this communist regime. So we should continue to engage with the Chinese people. And we should pressure the authorities publicly, economically, diplomatically. I can't stop talking about how dangerous the new digital authoritarianism that China has been actively promoting. Late 2018, there was a column published in one of the state-run official publication, specifically said that in order to handle the Muslim problem, the world's Muslim problem, come to us. We'll show you a few things. Unlike the United States, we don't bomb your cities. We don't kill your people. We build schools. We build hospitals. We build roads. We improve, upgrade your telecommunication system. We have a better deal. So they're promoting that. So I caution anyone who has a soft spot to distinguish between the Chinese people and the CCP, the Communist Party.
It's an extremely powerful note on which to end, a very sobering one, but one that underscores the criticality of the work of the American Society of International Law, the need for creative solutions in this time of crisis. Allow me to thank our panelists, Representative Joaquin Castro, Ms. Karuna Nandi, Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, Dr. Sophie Richardson, Mr. Nuri Turkel. Thank you for all the work you do each and every day for making the world a better place. We are very much in your debt. And please, to all of you who joined, we hope you found this conversation provocative and interesting, and we urge you to continue the conversation with us on March 24th from 1:15 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy the rest of the annual meeting. Thank you.